A Plea from the Grave by Nancy Roberts. There was food, champagne, caviar, paper-thin slices of Smithfield ham, canapes, smoked turkey, and more. A band played ragtime jazz, the strident notes of Somebody Stole My Gal, and then the romantic ballad, Roses Are Blooming in Tripoli, which started many of the guests reminiscing. The musicians played until shortly after midnight, and it was almost 1 o'clock before they had all left. Stephen Scott of Germantown, Pennsylvania, along with several others, had been invited to Cedarhurst Mansion in Huntsville, Alabama, for the weekend. Stephen was enormously pleased when he saw Cedarhurst for the first time, for it was just the sort of home that he had always envisioned Southerners living in. It wasn't quite as sumptuous as the houses in Gone with the Wind, Stephen thought as he dressed for the party, but it was still magnificent. He was amazed at the architecture. The rooms were immense, the ceilings high, the walls 15 inches thick. That's why his room was pleasantly cool. There was so much history here. In the early years, families had lived close to each other, and the afternoon of the big party, Stephen had visited the family cemetery of the Ewings. Stephen S. Ewing had purchased land here in 1823 from Ebenezer Titus. What an odd name Ebenezer was, Stephen mused. Were people ever named that anymore? It had some biblical meaning, he thought. Stephen had visited many of the Ewings that afternoon, not in the flesh, but at their graves. During the almost half a century that the family had lived in Cedarhurst Mansion, those who had passed on to the next world were buried out there in the cemetery. Stephen rather enjoyed looking at the carved marble flowers and reading the inscriptions on the stones. Some of the epitaphs were admittedly flowery, but others had real feeling in them. These days, a few words, or simply a name and date, suffice to characterize the deceased or the sentiments of those left behind. Were feelings deeper in the past, Stephen wondered? Or were some of these epitaphs simply the custom of the period? The next morning he slept late. It was 9:30 when he made his appearance at the breakfast table. His host and hostess were already having their coffee, and soon the cook appeared, carrying covered silver serving dishes from which rose the steam of scrambled eggs, grits, country ham, fried chicken, and hot biscuits. With the exception of the grits, which he considered tasteless, Stephen found everything delicious. Stephen's life as a young stockbroker at a major Philadelphia firm was reasonably pleasant, and even though his salary was a modest one, his parents had left him a comfortable income. Stephen had never been seriously interested in any woman, and was quite content to return alone, night after night, to the family home. Nellie, the same lady who had helped his mother, still came each Monday and Thursday, as she had done for years. She would straighten the house, change the sheets, and see that Mr. Stephen had an ample supply of clean attire. On the 1st of October, Nellie put down the comforter on his bed. On the last day of March, she removed it and tucked the lightweight summer blankets under the crocheted spread that his mother had made. Back in his room in Cedarhurst Mansion that night, Stephen reflected on the day's events before going to bed. He liked people and fancied that he understood their feelings. Someday when he retired, he thought he would write. The contribution he would make to literature would be stories about people he had known, stories filled with fresh, clever sights. He might even attempt a novel of manners mixed with humor, something that savored of Aldous Huxley. In any case, the novel would be pleasantly predictable. A tale with non-violence, no disorderly, tragic lives with all their loose ends. The unpredictable gave Stephen indigestion, and he judged most people to be like himself. They simply didn't need another book to disturb them. Why couldn't more writers understand that? He might start his writing career simply by doing an article now and then, perhaps a story about Cedarhurst. This was a delightful place, and such a story would give other Philadelphians an opportunity to experience vicariously a taste of what the Old South had really been like. He was sure that he could convey its gracious ambiance in a manner that would arouse his friend's envy. Stephen's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of distant thunder. The sheer white curtains at the open window rippled as the wind rushed through the trees. A summer shower was on the way, and that would cool things off nicely for tomorrow's activities with the other guests. Stephen fell asleep contentedly. When he awoke, it was to the sight of one brilliant flash of lightning after the other. Each sharp, explosive clap of accompanying thunder was followed by a succession of gradually receding rumbles. Stephen had been responsible for supplies at an ordnance department during World War II, and he recalled some explosives going off like that. The lightning and thunder continued, sounding uncomfortably close. In his childhood, when he would visit his great aunt and there was an electrical storm, the white-haired old lady and the little boy would retreat to her big bed for safety, piling pillows all around them. She would hug him and reassure him that the pillows would keep the lightning from striking. The curtains at Cedarhurst were now standing almost straight out, and gusts of rain had begun to pour through the windows onto the beautiful, wide plank floors. Stephen thought of closing the curtains, but at that moment there came a crash of thunder so loud and so close that he felt it must surely have split the house asunder. Sitting bolt upright in the big four-poster bed, he felt like dashing out into the hall to get away from the lightning. Instead, he closed his eyes and braced himself for the next detonation. But it didn't come. It was passing over, he thought, and he opened his eyes. Then he closed them tight. And next he blinked, but it did no good, for a girl in a long white dress was standing near the window. He buried his face in his pillows, and when he finally dared look again, the girl was gone. With a deep sigh of relief, Stephen pressed his arms close to his chest and hugged himself to keep from shaking, and started to lie down. "Help me. Please, help me," came a female voice, and there she stood again, this time right beside his bed. Tall, with long, dark hair, she was very lovely, but Stephen was too shocked to appreciate her beauty. "What kind of help? This terrible wind has blown my tombstone over." He was unable to reply. "You aren't very gentlemanly." "I'm sorry," he apologized, dimly aware that the wind had begun to blow again. "You must come to the cemetery with me and set it up again." Now, Stephen knew what happened. He had been struck by lightning and was dead. He was just as dead as the girl who was now standing there, speaking to him. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, she was gone. At that point, he felt as if he were on a cloud, drifting up in the air and through the sky. He didn't know where, and he didn't care. The next morning was a glorious, sun-drenched morning. Breakfast was served out on the side porch. It was 9 o'clock, and everyone was there, with the exception of one guest, Stephen Scott. "Shall we wait, or shall we eat without the sleeping lugger?" joked one of the men. "Let him sleep on. He's too popular with the ladies anyway," laughed another. "I think I'll go knock on Stephen's door," said their host. At that moment, the screen door to the porch opened, and everyone turned to look. It was Stephen, but his appearance was quite different from the night before. He was pale, and his hair and clothing were disheveled. Jokes about his late arrival evoked no answering smile. "Did you rest well, Steve?" inquired his host. "The storm woke me up. Quite something, wasn't it? Ghastly, I'd say." Leaving his breakfast almost untouched, Stephen wiped his mouth with his napkin and rose from the table. "Where are you off to, my friend?" asked his host. "I want to walk out into the cemetery." "At this time of the morning?" "We were out there most of the afternoon yesterday. If you want to go, I'll go on a walk with you." When they reached the cemetery, Stephen went directly to one grave. There, flat on the ground, lay the toppled tombstone of Miss Sally Carter, the 16-year-old sister of Mrs. Ewing. Miss Carter had died in 1837. He was certain now that it was Sally he had seen in his room. Stephen's face grew pale. Pleading the sudden onset of illness, he terminated his visit to Cedarhurst well before nightfall. It was odd, thought his host, that a man could be so shaken simply by a toppled stone on Miss Sally's grave. In the early 1980s, Cedarhurst, the historic Stephen Ewing house, and the land around it were sold. A developer has built private homes and townhouses in the immediate vicinity. The restored house sits at 2809 Whitesburg Drive in Huntsville, Alabama, and its interior remains much the same. The cemetery was moved in 1983 to an undisclosed location. We wonder whether the move was as unsettling to Miss Sally Carter as was a fallen tombstone. Will she appear some night to another guest at Cedarhurst and tell him that she needs his help? The end.